guest stars by, I'll be honest, I don't know who that is. Sorry, I like to try to introduce them, but this is a mystery. This is the masked singer, if you will.
He's the host.
Perfect. Well, my name's Caroline, and I'll be your tour guide today. Very excited that you've made it to the Hemingway house. It's a beautiful day by Key West standards, aka we're not sweating to death, so welcome. But I like to say I'm a teacher on a perpetual summer break. So if you have any questions or things that are of interest to you or something you want to know more about, stop me and ask your question. It enriches everyone's experience. It helps me to figure out what you're interested in because there's something here really for everyone. So I'm excited for you to get to figure out what that is for you. So this is the Hemingway house, but before we had the Hemingways, we had the Tiffs. So Asa Tiff, who's photographed in that picture, portraitized, I suppose, in that picture with those luscious mutton chops. Asa Tiff was the architect and builder of this house. The house was completed construction in 1851, and it was a mansion in the mid-1800s. So where did Asa Tiff get all this money to build a mansion in the middle of nowhere? Well, Asa Tiff was a salvage wrecker, which means that he and his crew would sit and watch the shoreline to see that your boat made it in safely to port. And if for some reason, perhaps an intentional reason, your boat wrecked out on our notoriously shallow waters that we have here in Key West, makes this great for snorkeling and scuba diving, but not so great if you're a large cargo ship with a wooden hull. So if your ship did wreck out on the coral, he and his crew would go out, they would save your life, they would bring your cargo back to port, and then they would sell it back to you for 4 times what it was worth. Making him very wealthy, perhaps a little unpopular, I like to say maybe the first member of the United States Coast Guard, but very, very wealthy nonetheless. Well, his wealth couldn't save his family from tragedy. Asa's wife and 3 young children passed away of yellow fever in this house. Now, Asa didn't contract the disease, but he never recovered from their deaths. He never remarried, he never had more children, and he died in this home, a recluse with no will. So with no one to claim the property, the house sat boarded up for 40 years, waiting for someone that could afford it, but also that could see its potential. So here come the Hemingways. Ernest Hemingway, and his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer. You didn't miss much. Asa Tiff, the picture right there. He was a pirate who built this house in 1851. Sorry, you guys, you got the long version. So, in 1928, Ernest Hemingway and his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, made their way down to Key West. Their intention was to pick up a car that Pauline's rich Uncle Gus had purchased for them as a delayed wedding gift, but the car was 6 weeks late. 6 weeks is all it took for them to fall in love with Key West. Pauline found this house, she phoned up rich Uncle Gus, and she asked that he purchase it for them. Talk about a bundle gift, right? A car and a house. Well, Uncle Gus shelled out for this home. He bought it for $8,000, which was 40 years worth of back taxes on the property. And the Hemingways began an extensive renovation process on this home. Remember, it's boarded up for 40 years. That tropical, this Babe Ruth, everybody, who wants me to introduce him. That tropical warm air is not kind to a property, so there was extensive renovations that needed to be done, but Pauline Pfeiffer, she was the editor of Vogue Paris during the 1920s. She was fashionable and she was a visionary. She saw this house for its potential, and I like to say this house is her love child. It has her fingerprints all over it. Her design aesthetics, her taste is all over this house, makes it really special. And Asa Tiff was also an architect. And he built this house, it's about 150 years before its true time. This house is outfitted with indoor plumbing. It had belt-driven ceiling fans, which is pretty remarkable. Actually, the ceiling fans are every place that you see a chandelier today. Pauline thought ceiling fans were tacky, so she ripped them all out. And instead she replaced them with Italian, Spanish, hand-blown glass chandeliers. Beautiful and highly impractical for the Florida Keys. You'll see those all over the house, so I encourage you to take photos of them. They're beautiful and they're original. Now, Pauline Pfeiffer is wife number 2, but there's a lot more where that came from, and I would love to introduce you to the other Mrs. Hemingway, so you can follow me to the dining room. Here we go. Alright, guys, come on in. And this wall is the focal point of our next few stories. Alright, so as you're coming in, I want you as this papa figure, right? White beard, white hair, likely due to his likeness depicted on every Sloppy Joe's t-shirt you see walking up and down the Wall Street. But that is not what Hemingway looked like when he called Key West home. He called Key West home from 1928 till 1940. So he was in his 30s, prime of his life. He was healthy, he was vibrant, happy. This is what he looked like. Okay, so when you're walking through the house, when you're walking the streets of Key West, maybe when you're having a drink at Sloppy Joe's bar later, this is who I want you to picture walking alongside you. Okay, this is who I want you to picture walking through the house, because this is what Hemingway looked like when he lived here. Okay, fun little tidbit. Also, I'm a teacher, so I'm all about a visual. All right, now this is what we call at the Hemingway house the Wall of Wives, or the Wall of Alimony. So I told you about Pauline. Okay, but before Pauline, there was Hadley Richardson. Hadley's portrait's right up here, the top left. Hadley and Ernest met at a cocktail party in Chicago. They were both working as writing journalists at the time. They met at a cocktail party. They were quickly married, and they whisked off to Paris. Paris was the mecca, or the collection zone, for all artists and journalists and creative minds at the time. They were part of the lost generation, if you know anybody about any of those folks. Well, it was during their time in Paris that they had their first son together. Hemingway's first son, John Bumby Hemingway. He was the father of the two famous Hemingway models and actresses, Margot and Marielle. But it was also during their time in Paris, their short marriage, that Hadley introduced Ernest to her best friend, Pauline Pfeiffer. Whoopsies. Whoopsies. Well, that ended Ernest and Hadley's marriage, and about 3 weeks later, Pauline found herself Mrs. Hemingway #2. Now, they came down to Key West. They had 2 sons together, Patrick and Gregory. Those boys grew up in this house, and this is their childhood home. So we're going to head upstairs to their bedroom here in just a little bit. Now, right along with that, someone else that grew up here was this little white fluff ball named Snow White. Snow White was the very first polydactyl cat here on property. She is clearly not the last one. We'll talk more about her upstairs. But it was during their time in Key West. Remember, this was their home. This is Pauline's home. Her love child, her fingerprints all over. She was the lady of this house. But it was during their time in Key West that a certain journalist, she was a work correspondent, set her sights on meeting Hemingway. Well, she was somewhat of a super fan. Today we would call her a stalker. She came here with one thing in mind, and that was to meet and interview Ernest. So she did what any good journalist would do. She put on her best cocktail dress. She marched her happy self down to Sloppy Joe's bar and waited for the inevitable, for Ernest to come down for his afternoon drink. Needless to say, the interview went so well that Martha Gellhorn became Mrs. Hemingway #3. Now, this was Ernest's shortest and arguably his most unhappy marriage. Martha was not about to just become a wife and do Ernest's laundry and cook his meals. No. She was a journalist, and she was a very famous war correspondent. She covered every war in her life from the Spanish Civil War up until Desert Storm. She was, in fact, the only woman on the beaches of Normandy during D-Day. She and Ernest were in a race to see who could make it there. He submitted his war correspondent pass. The government denied it, but Martha, being the tenacious woman she was, disguised herself as a sailor in a trench coat and a hat. She hid on board of a bathroom of a ship for 2 days until they made it to the beaches of Normandy. She emerged victorious and the only woman to do so. She was pretty remarkable, and she and Ernest were constantly at odds. Their marriage was only 4 short years, and it was a very unhappy 4 years for the both of them. It was during one of Ernest's trips abroad. Ernest was a notorious traveler. He loved to hop to different places where he sourced a lot of inspiration for his novels. On one of his trips, he hit his head and spent a few weeks recovering in hospital. While Martha was busy, she wasn't going to come visit him. She had things to do. But Mary Welsh did. She had time. And she sat by the ailing Ernest Hemingway's bedside. I'm sure spoke lovingly, kindly to him. And then quickly after his discharge from the hospital, she became Mrs. Hemingway #4. Now, this was her and Ernest, probably his happiest marriage. They were married for 16 years, and they shared a lot of the same hobbies. They loved to fish, they loved to ski at their house up in Ketchum, Idaho, and they loved to hunt. They did a lot of shoulder-to-shoulder activities, so I guess if you take anything from this room, Ernest's greatest marriage advice is to do more things that require less talking. All right, well, I'm going to take you back to the Paris years as we get upstairs. So we're going to go up this 16th to 18th century Stairmaster and to the first floor on the left. Here we go. room. But before it was the Paris room, it was the nanny's room. So in the early 1930s, when the Hemingways moved in, they moved in a few days before Christmas in 1931. They had a governess. Her name was Ada. She was a German immigrant. She cared for the boys from the time of their birth up until they were school age, and this was her room. Now, Ada was a very lucky lady because that bathroom behind you is original to the construction of the house, completed in 1851. Asa Tiff designed a cistern on the roof that collected rainwater. It drained into that bathroom to allow for indoor plumbing in the middle of the 1800s. It's about 150 years before the widespread technology is available to us sorry people to allow for indoor plumbing. So it's pretty remarkable. One more fun fact about this room. This fireplace right here, so it's twin sisters downstairs, right below that portrait of Hemingway. This is hand-carved Italian marble. It was intended for the New Orleans courthouse, but when the cargo wrecked out on the Coral and Asa Tiff brought it back to port, he hiked up that price so much the captain said, forget about it, whatever. Well, no average person can afford a hand-carved Italian marble fireplace, so Asa just installed those right into his house. I don't think that there's any ventilation to them. I don't think they've ever been turned on, but they make it look more upscale, right? So fancy. So our modern nickname for this room is the Paris room, and that's because Ernest spent most of the 1920s in Paris with his wife, Hallie Richardson. Now they became a part of what was called the Lost Generation. Now these are like, the starving artist trope on steroids. Okay, these are all of writers and creators and creative minds, and they've grouped together, they've convalesced at this point. And they have not quite made their fame and fortune. They've not quite made their break yet. Okay, but the Lost Generation is a pretty disparaging nickname for them. Because these are people like Ernest and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Pablo Picasso, very famous household names. But in the early 1920s, they were little known nobodies. Okay, so kind of interesting that Ernest is a part of a group like that. Because we know him, he's such a household name today. One more little tidbit before we leave this room. This portrait right up here, the center of this room, which is a young, in his 20s, Hemingway with this really gnarly scar on his forehead. We refer to that scar as a souvenir from Paris. It was on after a certain drunken night with a few too many martinis. If you know anything about Ernest, he had a few of those. Throughout his lifetime, he stumbled his way home, he went to the bathroom, and then he began pulling the chain to flush the toilet. The tank was mounted up on the wall, and then pulling the chain is what allowed the toilet to flush. Well, he's in the peak of his life, okay? He's in his mid-20s, he's healthy, barrel-chested, he's a boxer, very proficient boxer at this point. He's pulling the chain and it won't flash. Remember, he's a lot of drunk and probably a lot of frustrated as well. He's pulling and pulling, getting harder with every tug, well, only to find out that he's not pulling the toilet chain at all. He's pulling the chain to the glass ceiling skylight. Pulled that thing straight down in his head, it shattered, leaving him with this gnarly scar with many stitches to make Ernest whole again. He was very embarrassed of the story, as anyone would be, but he referred to the scar as a souvenir from Paris. Pretty good. Pretty good, right? All right, we're gonna head, this is the nanny's room, but we're gonna head into the boys' room. This is the room that Patrick and Gregory shared here on property, and talk more about Ernest's adventures. This room is also a lot larger and a lot better ventilated.
It's a big
It said he was so good that he could hook and reel one in under an hour.
those are big fish.
Oh yeah, like well over 200 pounds, pretty crazy. All right, well this is Ernest's adventure room. This is my favorite room in the house because it really captures Ernest's spirit. It really captures who he was. And something we should understand about Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway idolized Teddy Roosevelt. And when we know that about him, so much of his choices and who he set out to become in his life make a lot of sense. So who do we know about Teddy? What do we know about Teddy Roosevelt? Okay, Teddy was a patriot, he was a soldier, he was a great sportsman, a hunter and fisher of the life, okay? And Teddy Roosevelt died when Ernest was in his early 20s, so they never had the chance to meet, but Hemingway modeled his life after him. I think that really helped us to connect some of the dots on who Hemingway was. Well, a key part of that is military service. Well, contrary to many of his writings, Hemingway was actually never in the military himself. He tried to enlist in World War I at 18 years old, but he was denied because he had bad eyesight. So instead, he joined the American Red Cross, and they put him on a bicycle as a bicycle ambulance driver. Perfect job for someone who's nearsighted with no glasses. Well, Ernest was sent out to the front delivered chocolate and cigarettes to boost morale, and it was on that trip out that he and those men were hit with a mortar shell attack. Ernest was hit with over 200 pieces of shrapnel to his legs and to his back, and the doctors told him that he would never walk again. That's that photo that's taken right there, the Whistler. Ernest was 18 years old, and Ernest did what Ernest does best. He fell madly and deeply in love with his English-speaking nurse named Agnes von Kurowski. Her portrait's right up there. What a babe. Can you blame him? I mean, really. Well, Ernest spent only 6 months recovering in the hospital when he ultimately walked out. He made a full recovery, but was plagued with chronic pain for the rest of his life. But when he left behind a letter for Agnes, pledging his undying love and fealty to her and begging her to marry him and become Mrs. Hemingway #1. Now, we've seen the Wall of Wives. On this side of history, we know that Agnes is not among their ranks. Well, what Agnes never managed to tell Ernest in their 6 months together is that she was already engaged to an Italian officer. She had no business flirting with 18-year-old Hemingway. Not to mention, she was also 7 years his senior. Now, Ernest knew about the age gap and he didn't care, but Agnes cared. So, in response to his letter, she wrote back what we call the Dear Ernest letter. And it was in that letter that she writes, "Ernest, I've always regarded you as more of a son to me." We call it, we call it son zone, right? Well, Ernest is a fragile 18. This shatters his heart, and he carries that seed of bitterness with him for a very, very long time. That is until he wrote his novel, Farewell to Arms. Well, in the plot of that novel, the ambulance driver and the nurse fall in love. Ernest wrote 38 possible endings to that novel, but he settled on the one where he kills off the nurse in the last 2 pages. Agnes lived to be 94 years old. She lived a very long and healthy life, and she was alive for many years up to the publication of that novel, and I can't help but wonder if she ever read it to figure out how Ernest exacted his revenge on her. Pretty good. Pretty good. My favorite picture in this room is this picture up here on the top left. See a very large fish, as someone had previously commented on. We see a man cheersing at us in the middle, and then a very happy Ernest Hemingway on the right. Well, that guy in the middle is Mr. Sloppy Joe Russell himself. Sloppy Joe here, he was a bootlegger. He was a rum runner, which means he had access to the good stuff during Prohibition. He poured a good drink, I'm sure, and told a really great story, and he was Ernest's best friend and fishing buddy down here in Key West. We'll talk more about Sloppy Joes, but that is why Ernest spent many an afternoon sitting there at the bar. And then I would be doing a disservice to Ernest's legacy if I didn't talk about his African safaris while we were in here. So Ernest went on 2 separate safaris over his lifetime. We're going to focus on the first one, because the first one was 6 months long. Woo! Now, Ernest was kind of still a starving artist at this point, so who do you think funded that trip? Who bought the car and who bought the house? Rich Uncle Gus. Rich Uncle Gus, he financed that trip to the tune of $500,000 modern day dollars. Wow. Right? Well, it was on that first trip that he and the party that were with him survived 2 separate plane crashes. The plane crash that was picking them up from the hunting site crashed, and then the rescue plane crashed as well. Remember the mortar shell attack, the glass ceiling skylight, and then the 2 separate plane crashes. Ernest was not kind to his body. He was not gentle at all. He lived life hard and fast and to the fullest and was plagued with a lifetime of chronic pain. It was after those plane crashes that he only really wrote standing up, which is pretty interesting about him. Well, remember the Teddy Roosevelt tidbit? Well, they hired Philip Percival, who was Teddy Roosevelt's private big game guide in Africa, which is pretty cool. He's up there in the top left when we turn the corner with the safari hat on. But let's talk about Rich Uncle Gus, okay? He hired Teddy Roosevelt's personal guide. He spent $500,000 on this trip. He bought a car. He paid for the house. So, who is Uncle Gus and these bottomless pockets? I could use an Uncle Gus. Well, Uncle Gus, or Gustav Pfeiffer, he never married. He had no children of his own, so he loved to shower gifts and money on his favorite niece, Pauline. Well, Gustav Pfeiffer owned a very successful chemical company that became a pharmaceutical company that we call Pfizer. So Rich Uncle Gus was rolling in it in the 30s, and he would still be rolling in it today if he was still alive. So we don't need to worry about Gus. All right, well, we're going to head into Ernest and Pauline's room, and I'm going to tell you more about cats. No such luck today. I talk about the cats in here, and it's not just because of this beautiful Henry Faulkner painting above the bed or the replica of the Picasso sculpture of the cat behind you. It's usually because we have about 2 to 3 cats that like to lounge about on this bed right here. No such luck today, but don't worry, I have it all memorized. So, remember the Hemingways moved in here in 1931. Well, Ernest spent a lot of time down at the shipyards fishing. He loved to fish. And so during his time down there, he met a Navy captain. Well, the Navy captain gifted him the first polydactyl cat, Snow White. I told you about her downstairs, remember? She grew up in this house. Hemingway brought her back here, gave her to the boys, and she had free range of this property, which probably explains why we now have 61 cats. It said back then Hemingway lost count at 70. He was not doing any kind of control breeding as pandemonium out there. So Snow White was a very busy kitty. But why did the Navy have these cats, these 6-toed cats? Well, the Navy believed them to be good luck. So fill in whatever lore you want to believe about how they settled on that conclusion. But the sixth toe makes them very nimble, able to run across the edges of boats, climb ropes, and catch rats and mice. So making them a very popular furry companion on long trips across the sea. So it's someone's job in the Navy to specially breed them. They would release them on the boats, they would release them in the shipyards to catch rats, to bring good luck. Ernest was very superstitious, and as I told you about all the bumps and bruises, could use all the good luck he could get. And not to mention they make really fun little furry companions. So we're lucky we have 61. They are federally protected, and we do control breed them. We only have about 1 litter every year. We currently have about 13 week-old kittens. There's 8 of them, and they're out in the cat tower outside. They're very sweet and playful, and very soon they'll be released onto the property, which is very fun. Does anyone have any questions about our cats?
Do they wander away or do they stay here?
They stay. They stay.
Does you have some fence that keeps them or not?
There is a fence around the whole property, but really their only exit point is the gate they all walk in, and there's always people walking in and out, and they love it here. They have free reign. There's lots of food, water. We have 4 ladies that take care of them. They're our groundskeepers and our cat carriers, and they love them. Those are their mothers, so they stick close to those gals.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Does anyone have any other questions about the cats? Okay, well then I'll have to talk about the furniture. Okay, remember that the Hemingways moved in here right at the start of the Great Depression. Key West was one of the poorest cities in the United States during the Great Depression. Well, thankfully, Ernest was very resourceful. There are many stories in Key West lore of Ernest showing that resourcefulness. He was notoriously very philanthropic. He would give you a shirt off his back. He was known for running around town and making things work. He was a great problem solver and had a great sense of ingenuity. Well, lucky for him, he married a very fashionable woman. So in their case, those little crafts of ingenuity also turned out to be pretty stylish as well. Thanks, Pauline. So these little chairs, these are actually Spanish birthing chairs. Ernest discovered them on one of his trips to Spain. There's 2 in here and 2 in the Navy's bathroom because he thought they made great fishing chairs. They have handles. This one is actually foldable, which is pretty cool. They were lightweight and portable, and he was able to carry them from the house to the boat, to the shipyard, and back home. So pretty fun. This headboard is actually a 16th century hand-carved monastery gate. Ernest and Pauline made a sizable donation to a monastery in Spain. I'm sure Pauline nudged him, and Ernest opened up the wallet, and look what we have. This gate, they brought it back. It's still fastened with the original latches, but they brought it back, and their gardener made it into the headboard for them. So their ingenuity is throughout this whole place. A lot of resourcefulness. It took a lot of resourcefulness to furnish a house during the middle of the Great Depression, which is pretty cool. And then that bathroom behind you, that's not original to the construction of the house finished in 1851. That was added on during their extensive renovation of the house. And the toilet is actually behind that little, I think it's Ace Hardware, that little block. Yes, so we'll see it when we wrap around the corner. That comes with a pretty fun little story. Ernest referred to that as his seat with a view, and you'll see why when you see it. He would open up the window. He loved to edit his stories. He would also holler down at people on the street. He would tell stories, make plans for the night, spread some gossip, or sit and edit, which is such a man thing to do. All you women, But I've kept you inside for as long as I can. Take all the pictures you want, and then we're going to head out these double doors, and we're going to talk more about Ernest's writing career. Okay? That's so dreamy. Okay, so I didn't mention it in the Paris room. In the Paris room, we have one of the last photos of Hemingway that was taken. It was taken about 3 weeks before his death. Well, Hemingway's death was a culmination of quite a few things, but chief among them was pretty severe mental illness. Ernest was very depressed for most of his life and battled undiagnosed bipolar depression as well. And I'd like to add that in because it really adds a degree of appreciation for someone who created really amazing work but had to overcome quite a bit in order to be so successful. I think it's pretty remarkable. Well, alongside that little spell of mental illness, he also had insomnia. Well, if y'all spent any morning in Key West, you know that the sun comes up early and it comes up really bright. So Hemingway would walk out of these double doors he just walked out of. He would walk across a metal catwalk, which was taken out by the hurricane in 2017. But it connected from the edge of the terrace. It went through what's now overgrown bamboo and would deposit him into his writer's studio. Now, when Asa Tiff built the house, below was the carriage house with stables for the horses, and then a hayloft up above. So when the Hemingways purchased the home in 1928, they renovated the hayloft to be Ernest's writing studio. Well, Ernest would write about 700 words every day, which would wrap him up right around lunchtime, which is the perfect time to head to the docks and catch some fish for dinner. But 700 words a day, over 9 years, ended up being about 70% of Ernest's final published works he completed here in Key West. So he had an incredibly successful, incredibly productive 9 years because it was the healthiest 9 years of his life. So I don't take you up on the writing studio during the tour because it only holds about 2 to 3 people at a time. But after our tour, I'll point out the stairs to you and I want you to go and look at it because it's frozen in time. Now, Ernest left Key West in 1940 and he never called this place home again. But the writer studio is frozen in time. It's left exactly as Ernest left it in 1940. Those are his books. That's his real deal typewriter that he carried back and forth on all of his travels and tapped all those 70% of his finished works on, which is pretty remarkable. Those are his big game mounts up on the wall, everything. My lovesick heart wants to believe that Pauline thought that maybe, just maybe, he would come back and call this place home again. Well, he never did, but she preserved so much of his legacy up in there, so I want you to go back and see it. Okay.
So she kept this house.
She did, yes. She kept this house. She died very suddenly. She wasn't here, but she never changed her will. So she left the house to Ernest. Well, then when Ernest died in 1963, it was left to the boys. Well, then the boys had established their own lives. They lived up in Montana, and they didn't need the house until they sold it. And I'll tell you more about who they sold it to when we go. Does anyone else have any questions? 61. 62. Born in 1899. Okay, we're going to head around. And as we're passing, I want you to look at our peculiar place lighthouse. I'm going to tell you a little bit of some Key West history when we get to the front. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the tree of Key West where someone was like an Indian. Yes. I wish Jamie was here because she could tell you. Okay, this big area right here, our backyard, if you will, or a side yard, we host about 200 plus weddings every year. We think that really honors Ernest's legacy. He was really good at marrying them. He just wasn't so good at staying married, right? Our event planners like to say, and if the first one doesn't work out, we can host the second one for you too. You know. Here's that seat with the view over behind that frosty window. All right. So now remember, if you remember back to our first conversation about Asa Tiff. Okay, Asa Tiff was a salvage wrecker, which would have meant that he needed to be able to see the ocean to be able to do his job, to make his fortune, whatever. Okay. Well, Ernest wouldn't have been caught very far from the ocean either. So if you look at the geography of this house, you can see that we're not oceanfront property anymore. So what happened? Well, this in the early 1800s, the Navy established this as a Navy town. Well, when the large cargo ships started becoming very popularized in the Navy, so in the mid-1900s, the Navy started dredging out shipping channels for their large cargo ships and for their shipyards to be. And as they did that, they would deposit those sediments on the outside of the island. Initially, Key West was only 4 square miles, but they doubled the size of the island to 8 square miles. And as they did that, they landlocked in this beachfront property, and they landlocked in our lighthouse. So a lot of people are like, why is the lighthouse not by the ocean? Well, it used to be by the ocean. The Navy just locked it in, right? So they modified our landscape a little bit and doubled the size of the island. So special thanks to the Navy, right?
Yep.
And what years was that, you think?
It's like the mid-1900s. This is always a Navy town. So it's established as a Navy town in like the early 1800s. It's like an anti-piracy organization. Yeah, kind of interesting. My husband's Coast Guard, so I'm like, I love the military lore. All right, now Ernest also had between 7 and 9 confirmed concussions in his lifetime. Okay, the house was built in 1851. People were a lot shorter in those days. Ernest was 6 feet tall. If you're any taller than me, you're gonna want to duck under this low-hanging beam down the stairs. We can't rule it out that it didn't cause 1 or 2 of those concussions, right? So we're gonna head down the stairs this time. Okay, that's the set of James.
Is that a James?
Yes, this one has alien eyes also. Anna, I wish she would look at you. She's kind of, she's a little alarming.
You can imagine. They get it all the time.
She's not interested. She's loved and adored all day long. She's like, oh, this again. Look, paparazzi. Hi, baby girl. She's so sweet. We're gonna follow these little 75-year-old cat prints into the courtyard at the fountain. So if you want to head on in, and I'll. They are. Isn't that fun?
They're in the wet concrete.
75 years old.
Oh, really?
So the cats that made these prints are long gone. Yeah. Someone tried to fill in the cistern, the well, with concrete. Now this fountain is the backdrop of one of our last stories. It's a pretty good story. So up top we have a Spanish olive oil jar. It's brought back by Pauline on one of their travels. Remember, she was fashionable and she had a great sense of ingenuity. So she saw it and she thought it would make the perfect cat drinking fountain. Well, it still uses that today. Our cats love it. Piper Laurie can be seen climbing around the rim of that jar pretty frequently. But below, we have a thrifted item, if you will. Does anyone have any guesses on what that could be? It is, but what signature piece? Oh, a urinal indeed. But it's not just any urinal. Don't worry, that would be gross. It's a urinal from Sloppy Joe's bar. So how did Ernest... Yeah, I guess, right? At least it has a good story attached, right?
Yes.
So, the story goes like this. Remember Sloppy Joe Russell pictured in that photo up in the adventure room? Well, Sloppy Joe was a bar owner. He's the bar owner namesake, Sloppy Joe's Bar. Well, the original Sloppy Joe's was located at what we now call Captain Tony's. Okay. Well, the landlord hiked up the price of rent post-prohibition ending from $3 a month to $4 a month. Remember, Sloppy Joe the pirate, he thought he was close to getting robbed. He said $1, that's the straw that broke the camel's back. So he called all of his friends down to his bar, he poured up some drinks, and they had a moving out party. They left that landlord with nothing they got at the place. They took the tables and the chairs and their martinis, and they marched right around the corner to the current resting place of Sloppy Joe's Bar, and they set up shop there. Well, in the move around, this urinal was deposited in the middle of Duval Street. Well, Ernest, he had a little liquid courage, maybe more a little liquid creativity, and he saw it and he told Joe. He said, Joe, I have poured a fortune down that drain. I might as well just take it home with me. So he strapped it to his back and carried it the 8 blocks from Sloppy Joe's Bar back to the house, and he deposited it here. Now remember Pauline, his wife at the time, wouldn't have ceiling fans in her house? Imagine her horror and dismay that there is a urinal in her backyard. Okay? Well, so she did her best. She surrounded the bottom with these imported Spanish tiles, but it'll never change the fact that it is a urinal from a bar. I can't imagine the heated arguments that they had over this thing, but in the end, Pauline won with this here revenge swimming pool. Let me tell you the story. We're going to head over to the pool deck. with the two boys. Yes, Hadley had the first John, and then Patrick had the All right, we all come to pool in all of the Florida Keys. Can't even get permits to build them this big. So what happened? Well, in the mid-1930s, 1936, 35, Ernest planned a trip to Spain to source inspiration for his upcoming novel. Well, that trip to Spain happened to coincide with a certain beautiful blonde's trip to Spain. Remember wife number 3, Martha Gelfand? That's right. Ernest ran off to Spain with Martha, and Pauline heard about it through the grapevine. So when she found out, she was naturally curious. He left her behind to take care of this very large property and their 2 young children. But she didn't call and demand that Ernest come home or take herself to Spain and make a scene or anything. No, she hid it where it hurts. She went down to the bank and she withdrew a sizable amount of money and she began construction on Whistler's Bay. So the pool took 10 months to complete. Pauline placed a permit with the city asking if they could use dynamite to excavate the pool, but the city declined the permit, so instead the workers had to by hand pickaxe out that coral limestone rock incredibly hard. Pauline didn't care. Whatever it costs, however long it takes. So 10 months later, Ernest makes his way home. Okay, it's 1937, concrete's still wet. Okay, Ernest makes his way home from his trip to Spain. Pauline knows what he's been up to. Okay, he turns the corner. I'm sure he stopped dead in his tracks. And the first question he asks is, where's my boxing ring? Well, what I haven't told you yet is there used to be a regulation-sized boxing ring right where this pool is sitting. Remember, Ernest loved to box. He's a notorious boxer, all those concussions, right? He's actually a boxing coach here in Key West. He'd invite all the boys over, they'd box a few rounds and go out for refreshments at Sloppy Joe's bar. So Pauline ripped that thing out. She gave it to the bodega down the street. That's now the Blue Haven. And instead began the construction over her pool. So once they cleared up the first question, that if he wanted to see that tacky boxing ring again, he'd have to go down to the brothel and take his new girlfriend with him. Right? Once they cleared that up, Ernest asked the next question that every husband and father asks, which is, how much did this cost? Well, when Pauline delivered the punchline that the swimming pool in 1937 cost $20,000. Wow. Do you want to know how much that is in modern day money? That's $425,000 on a swimming pool. Okay, Ernest is livid, right? Good on her, right? But Ernest is pissed. Okay, naturally, he would be. Red face, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a coin and he says, Pauline, if you're gonna spend my money so recklessly, you might as well have my last red cent too. He throws the penny at her feet and he leaves. Okay? At this point, Pauline's counting up her losses. He's already starting to fear with Martha. He hasn't called the place home in 10 months. It's over. She spent $425,000 of his money. It's over. But instead of allowing that situation to make her angry or callous, she decides to take a lighthearted approach to a tragic situation. She picks up that 1930 Denver mint penny. She presses it into the concrete right here at the base of this post. And she loved to tell her friends at her pool party that Ernest could have as many wives as he wanted because she would always have his last red cent. Don't you just love Pauline? She's so great. So, who saved this place? Remember, I told you that Pauline died very suddenly. She never changed her will, so Ernest was left to inherit the house after Pauline's death. Well, Ernest took his own life in 1963, and he left the house to the boys. The boys had a life. They had established a life for themselves at Montana. They didn't need this place anymore. Fidel Castro had taken charge over Cuba, so this was a stop on their way to Cuba. So they couldn't go to Cuba anymore. So they sold it to a lady named Bernice Dixon for $80,000. Now Bernice wanted to live here. Right? What a steal! It's almost an acre. It's the largest residential property in all of the U.S. What a steal! Well, Bernice wanted to live here. She's a local jewelry store owner. She was a great friend of Pauline. She likely heard that red cent story a few times. So she bought it, she moved into the front house. But after so many knocks at the door, everyone wanting to see where the famed writer Ernest Hemingway lived in Key West, she gave up. She moved into the back house, which is now our bookstore, and she turned the front into a museum. So we largely credit Bernice Dixon with preserving all of the artifacts, all of the treasures inside, and for preserving so much of Ernest's legacy here in Key West. The home and the property are still in her family's name. It's privately owned and cared for, which is really special. It's likely why it's not an Airbnb like many of our historical sites here in Key West. But we love Bernice. She's a very special lady. She had a great vision for this place, and she's why you got to come and enjoy today. But that's the end of my tour. I hope y'all enjoyed it. I'll stick around for if y'all have any questions for me. I'd love to answer them. Otherwise, please go up to that writer's studio, back through the house, take pictures of the garden, find all those 61 cats. Best of luck to you, and y'all enjoy Key West.
There's one in the pool.
You were
The Hemingways, Catherine Jane renamed her Snow White. Well, Snow White was a busy kitty and she had a lot of ascendants. Hemingway used to get a lot of fun out of naming his cats after his famous friends, and he continued that tradition. But he also gave them funny names like Dillinger, Friendless, and Fur House. In the 8 years that he lived here, he wrote 70% of his life's work in that studio.